As it's something that I've been promising you for a while now, I think it's finally time for me to show you how I went about building an up-to-date version of the Crimson Fist Chapter Master. I'm Pete the Wargamer, and in this video I'll be kitbashing a Primaris Pedro Kantor. Normally, at this point in the video, I show you components being clipped away from a sprue, but this time around, I started off with this old painted Primaris Lieutenant that's been sat in a box for about 3 years now. Kitbashing isn't just about using new kits and components to build models, so I decided to use this model as my basis instead of buying a fresh kit. Now, before I could build anything with this model, I needed to remove the paint, not only to make attaching new parts to it much easier, but also to give me a fresh start for when I came to paint it. Now, I'd recently been sent this product to try out. It's called Paint Blitzer and is made by a company called Untitled Chapter. Now, I've used various paint stripping methods in the past: Dettol, paint thinners, acetone, isopropyl alcohol, and simply scraping it off with a knife. All have their successes and their drawbacks. However, none of those have been specifically designed with stripping the paint from miniatures. They're usually intended for other purposes and have the additional effect of removing the paint from models too. But this particular product is different because it's been designed and intended for use on miniatures. So I placed my Lieutenant into a small tub and poured on the Paint Blitzer. It's a thick, viscous liquid, and while it had some smell, it wasn't as overpowering as other paint strippers I've used before. Whilst it's also non-toxic and generally a safer option to other paint removing products, I still opted to use gloves here, just to prevent any paint staining my fingers. With the model completely covered, I left him alone for about an hour for the paint remover to do its work. Whilst I was waiting for the paint to be removed, I could start to cannibalize the Pedro Kantor Finecast kit. This would give me a number of components that I could use to add some flavour to the generic Primaris Lieutenant model. However, the Finecast kit was, for the most part, a single piece model, which meant I needed to get sawing. I started out by sawing through the right arm. I wanted to remove the iconic power fist of Pedro Kantor, but didn't need his shoulder pad or his arm. I would instead use those of the Primaris, which would give me a better scaled length of arm. I sawed from beneath the arm, working my way up towards the shoulder pad, all the while trying to retain as much of the power fist as I could. With the fist removed from the arm, I needed to do some cleanup. I began by clipping away the small length of pipe that was still attached to the outside of the fist. This had been connected to the arm, but as it wasn't present on the Primaris model, keeping it wouldn't have made sense. Once clipped away, I then used my knife to smooth out the area that the pipe had been attached to, as well as where I had sawn through the arm. The left arm required some chopping up too. This time I wanted to keep both the shoulder pad and the forearm along with the bolter's ammo belt, which did make things a little trickier. However, this arm was at least already separate from the torso, which did help things a little. I started out by sawing through the arm behind the bolter before sawing up from beneath the shoulder pad in order to keep the trim of it intact. While sawing, I used a mask and vacuumed up any resin dust as soon as possible. Resin isn't the safest of materials to work with, so I'd recommend taking precautions. Once I had removed the parts from the arms, I just needed to remove the tassets and the belt buckle from Pedro's torso. This proved to be the hardest to cut away so far, as a lot of sawing needed to be performed and the tassets themselves were quite fragile. I started by sawing up either side of the tassets to remove them from the legs. I then followed this by sawing across the torso, just above the belt, which freed up the belt from the rest of the model. I followed this up with some additional clipping and trimming to remove anything that I hadn't been able to saw away. Chopping up the Finecast Pedro Kantor took me around an hour or so to complete, which was the perfect amount of time to have left the Lieutenant in the Paint Blitzer. So I donned my gloves once again and removed the model from the tub. I then placed this into another tub of water before I began to scrub away the paint using a cheap 35p toothbrush. Now, I did finish off this scrubbing under a running tap, but I wanted to demonstrate this process on camera without lugging my studio lights into my bathroom. But even without the running water, the Paint Blitzer had done its job nicely and the paint came away with very little effort. After I had finished scrubbing, I was left with this. Now, I should note that I got a little too vigorous with the brushing and knocked off his power sword, but this wasn't a problem as I wasn't planning to use this hand anyway. You can see that the vast majority of the paint had been removed, with only a very small amount still residing in the deepest of the recesses. In addition to this, the paint blitzer hadn't caused any damage to the model itself. The plastic was still crisp and detailed and hadn't become soft. So, with the paint removed, I needed to break down the model. Luckily, I hadn't used a fantastic plastic glue when I had first built this model, so it was pretty easy to remove both the arms, the head, and the backpack with just my fingers. Additionally, as I wanted to create more of a scenic base, I removed the model from its current base too. Now that I had all of my base parts, I could begin to assemble them. I started off with the left arm, as I wanted to extend the left arm to be more Primaris scaled whilst keeping the original forearm and shoulder. I began to saw through the plastic, starting just below the shoulder pad. I trimmed the newly freed elbow before comparing it against the resin shoulder. This gave me a good idea as to where I needed to cut along the forearm. This was once again done with the saw before cleaning up the cut with a knife. With the arm trimmed down to a more manageable length, I could check how well it was fitting. I still needed to make a few trims here in order to get the perfect fit, but once this was done, I was able to superglue the lengthened arm into place. Luckily, the fine cast was fairly soft and pliable, which allowed me to stretch out the ammo belt to allow for the now Primaris scaled arm. Now, even though I had tried to cut the arm in such a way that allowed for the best fit, I still had a gap that needed to be filled. So I reached for my perfect plastic putty. It's pre-mixed, so I just needed to squeeze it out of the tube, press it into the gap, and smooth it out with a dampen tool before leaving it to dry. The right arm was much more straightforward, as I only need to add Pedro's power fist to the end of the arm. Therefore, this only required me to saw through the lieutenant's right arm just below the elbow. I trimmed and filed the cut clean before supergluing the power fist into place. Next, I wanted to attach Pedro Kantor's belt and tassets to the lieutenant's torso. While the pose was wide enough to be able to add the belt, I still needed to remove the existing belt buckle in order to make room for the new one. I cut and clipped the existing buckle before making a few incremental trims to the fine cast in order to make sure that I could properly fit. Once these small but important adjustments had been made, I could glue the belt into place. With the torso and arms completed, I could turn my attention to Pedro's banner. This came already attached to the smaller Firstborn Space Marine backpack, but I wanted to attach this to the Primaris power pack, and I needed a stronger way to attach it, so I chose to pin it. I'd already clipped the banner pole from the top of the original power pack, and so just needed to use my pin vise to drill a small hole into the underside of the pole before drilling another 1mm diameter hole into the top of the power pack. To strengthen the bond between the pole and the pack, I grabbed some 1mm thick wire and glued this into the banner pole with some superglue. Once dried, I clipped the wire to length, leaving only a couple of millimeters protruding from the fine cast component. This was then glued and inserted into the hole at the top of the power pack, resulting in a much stronger bond than if I had just used glue alone. With the banner glued, the power pack was completed. I didn't attach the power pack just yet, however, as I wanted to keep this separate for ease of painting. The final step was the head. This was kept as it is. It fitted nicely into the existing socket joint without any adjustment, but much like the power pack, I decided to keep this separate for the time being in order to make it easy to paint, which is exactly what I did next. After painting and assembling and basing the model, I was left with this. And here we have the completed Primaris Pedro Kantor, Chapter Master of the Crimson Fist. I painted him in the usual Crimson Fist colours, as well as mounting him on a suitably ornate base. While this finecast kitbash was much more straightforward than my previous attempt at a Primaris Halbrecht, it was still a challenge to use finecast. Plastic is generally much easier to work with, and the sculpting quality generally tends to be more consistent. However, I felt that it was important to carry these more iconic and recognisable aspects of Pedro Kantor over to his new incarnation. If you haven't already seen my previous Primaris characters guides, then please do check out my Halbrecht and Kato Sicarius guides, and feel free to leave me your suggestions for other characters you'd like to see me update next. You can find a link to the paint blitzer that I used to clean up the Lieutenant in the link below, with a limited time discount code for it as well. And so, the final thing to say is a massive thank you to all of my supporters. Whether you support me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, or you just use my affiliates links, your help is what keeps this channel alive, and it's what allows me to build these conversions for you. If you would like to help me out, then you can find all the relevant links in the description below, and please do subscribe and leave this video a like if you enjoyed it. And so until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.